39 seconds. That is the entire gap between the first earthquake and the second. Not 39 minutes, not 39 hours. 39 seconds. The time it takes to tie your shoes, pour a glass of water, or read a single paragraph. In that window, northern Venezuela was hit by two of the most powerful earthquakes to strike this hemisphere in over a century. A magnitude 7.2 followed by a magnitude 7.5. Back to back. The same fault system, the same terrified population. Scientists have a name for this. They call it a doublet. And what makes the Venezuela doublet so alarming, what kept seismologists awake through the night of June 24th, is not just the death toll, though that number is still climbing. It's what the sequence revealed about a fault system that has been silently loading for 125 years. The ground beneath Caracas had been waiting, and on Wednesday evening, it stopped waiting. To understand why this particular earthquake was so devastating, you need to understand where Caracas sits, not just on a map, but inside the earth. Venezuela occupies one of the most geologically complex corners of the Western Hemisphere. The country straddles the boundary between two massive tectonic plates, the Caribbean plate to the north and the South American plate to the south. These two plates do not collide head-on. They grind past each other horizontally, moving at roughly 20 millimeters per year, the same speed your fingernails grow. That motion is accommodated by a network of right lateral strike-slip faults that run like scars across Venezuela's northern edge for 1,300 kilometers, all the way from the central Andes to the coast of Trinidad. Three fault systems dominate this zone: the Boconó fault, which threads through the Venezuelan Andes, the San Sebastian fault, which runs offshore near the capital, and the El Pilar fault, which bisects the northeast. Together, they form one of the most energy-loaded fault networks in South America. And Caracas, home to nearly 3 million people, economic center of a nation already in crisis, sits directly inside a deep sedimentary basin. That detail matters enormously, and we will come back to it. Before June 24th, the most damaging modern earthquake in this region was the 1967 M6.6 Caracas quake, which collapsed high-rise apartment buildings and killed approximately 280 people. The 2026 doublet was significantly more powerful than that event, and it arrived without a single second of advance warning. At 22:04 UTC on June 24th, 6:04 in the evening, local time, the USGS detected the first shock, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake centered roughly 24 kilometers northeast of the town of San Felipe, at a depth of 21.9 kilometers. The rupture originated along a strike-slip fault zone at the western end of Venezuela's Caribbean coastal system. The shaking from a 7.2 earthquake does not stop quickly. The rupture front travels outward from the epicenter at roughly 3 kilometers per second, cracking rock across a fault surface stretching approximately 150 kilometers long and 20 kilometers deep. People in Caracas, 280 kilometers to the east, began to feel the ground move within seconds. Then, 39 seconds after the first event was recorded, a second rupture began. Magnitude 7.5, centered just north of the first. A M7.5 earthquake releases approximately 3 times the energy of a M7.2. The population of northern Venezuela, already on their feet, already running for doors and stairwells, was hit again before the first shaking had even subsided. The USGS tsunami warning system activated immediately. Advisories were issued for the coasts of Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the northern Venezuelan coastline. Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao were placed on alert. Maritime operations across the Caribbean corridor were suspended. Those advisories were eventually canceled, but for nearly 2 hours, roughly 30 million people along the Caribbean basin sat in uncertainty about whether a wave was coming. In Caracas, the picture emerging in the hours after the doublet was unlike anything residents had seen in their lifetimes. A 22-story building in the Altamira neighborhood, one of the capital's most densely populated districts, was completely destroyed. Footage showed volunteers climbing over rubble in the dark, shouting names. Dust columns rose over 2 separate neighborhoods simultaneously. Collapsed electric poles blocked streets. Parts of the city lost cell phone signal entirely, severing families from each other in a country where more than 7.7 million people already live in diaspora abroad. Simón Bolívar International Airport, Venezuela's primary connection to the outside world, sustained severe structural damage and was shut down. Footage circulated showing debris falling inside the terminal, with passengers and staff running for cover. Venezuela's acting president declared a nationwide state of emergency. At least 164 people were confirmed dead by Thursday morning. At least 971 injured. The USGS pager system, the agency's predictive model for catastrophic events, estimated a 44% probability that the final death toll would fall between 10,000 and 100,000 people. A 30% probability that it would exceed 100,000. Stop for a moment. Let that number sink in. 1 in 3 odds that this event kills more than 100,000 human beings. And rescue teams are still pulling people from the rubble as this video is being produced. The coastal state of La Guaira, home to roughly 400,000 people, Venezuela's main seaport and the airport that connects the capital to the world, was declared a full disaster zone within hours. Both are now offline. A survivor named Luis Alejandro Ruiz Garcia described receiving a Google earthquake alert a split second before the first tremor reached Caracas. He had just enough time to register the notification before the walls began to crack around him. Here's what made this event unusually destructive, and why the doublet structure is so scientifically significant. A strike-slip earthquake is different from the subduction earthquakes most people picture when they think of disaster. There is no plate diving beneath another. Instead, 2 crustal blocks slide horizontally past each other like 2 sheets of sandpaper grinding face to face. When that friction suddenly releases, the energy doesn't travel vertically. It radiates outward along the surface with tremendous force in a long horizontal corridor. Now imagine that energy wave traveling 280 kilometers east and hitting Caracas, a city built on a deep sedimentary basin. Seismologists describe sedimentary basins as amplifiers. The soft sediment beneath the city traps and bounces seismic waves, extending their duration and increasing their intensity in ways that solid rock would not. Buildings in Caracas's Altamira district were especially vulnerable precisely because they sit on sediment, not bedrock. The doublet adds another layer of complexity. A M7.2 earthquake ruptures a fault surface over the course of roughly 30 to 40 seconds. The M7.5 began before that rupture had even finished. Whether these were 2 separate events that triggered each other or 2 parts of a single cascading rupture is something seismologists are still working to determine. The answer matters because it affects how we model the aftershock sequence and whether the fault system has more stored energy to release. The USGS Aftershock forecast as of Thursday morning gives a 40% probability of a magnitude 6 or larger aftershock in the week following the main shock. A magnitude 5 or larger, essentially certain. Venezuela is a nation of 28 million people. It is also a nation in the middle of an ongoing humanitarian crisis. Years of economic collapse, infrastructure deterioration, and mass emigration have left large portions of its housing stock weakened and its emergency services under-resourced. That context is not incidental to this disaster. It is central to it. The buildings that collapsed in Caracas on Wednesday evening were not new. Many were informal structures, the kind that a building inspector in a wealthier country would have flagged for reinforcement decades ago. A seismologist described much of the country's urban housing as built without earthquake-resistant design. On a fault system of this magnitude, that is a death sentence. A survivor named Maria Alejandra described the moment the walls cracked around her. She managed to force her door open through the debris. When she reached the stairwell, she said, it looked like something out of a horror movie. She had to climb over rubble to reach the street. From her entire building, she told reporters, she only saw one family make it out. The United Nations Emergency Relief Chief described the event as devastating and pledged full international response. The United States announced it was deploying search and rescue teams and medical resources. For a country that has struggled to accept international aid in recent years, the scale of this disaster may represent a turning point, but only if help arrives before the rescue window closes. At 44% odds of a death toll between 10,000 and 100,000, this is not a disaster that has finished unfolding. It is a disaster still in progress. Here is the number scientists are watching right now, 2%. That is the current USGS probability that the M7.5 main shock was itself a foreshock, that something larger is still coming. 2% sounds small, but on a fault system that has been accumulating stress since 1900, 2% is not a number anyone in Caracas is sleeping easily with tonight. The Boconó Morón El Pilar fault system runs 1,300 kilometers across northern Venezuela. Wednesday's rupture released stress in one segment. Seismologists are now running models to determine how that release affected adjacent segments, whether the energy transfer increased or decreased risk along the faults that were not involved in the doublet. The USGS will update its aftershock forecast daily. The rescue window for people trapped beneath collapsed structures closes within 72 hours, and the questions about what this event means for the long-term seismic risk to Caracas, a city of 3 million built in a sedimentary basin on an active plate boundary with aging housing stock, will not have answers for months. What the seismographs show us right now is a fault system that moved farther and faster than most models predicted. That gap between prediction and reality is exactly where the next disaster hides. Subscribe to Seismic Alert. We will be here when it moves again.